Hello, Lake Valley. We are back at it. Tutorial for home group pastors. Hope you guys are doing good, had a good summer, ready to get back into the fall. This is our first tutorial for the year, and we are in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Lord's Prayer, it says, "May your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." Earth as it is in heaven. Well, Jesus is bringing this idea, and so let's talk about it as we look at Jesus, our Messiah. One of the things we think is really important for your home groups is to understand the link between the New Testament and the Old Testament. That the Old Testament is not irrelevant because it's old. There's actually so much that we learned in his story from the Old Testament and how in the Old Testament the Messiah is concealed. In the New Testament, he is revealed. And the Old Testament, we have the law. We have the Torah, the first 5 books. In the New Testament, Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish all that. I came to fulfill it. And right here in the Sermon on the Mount, we begin to see Jesus' new agenda, his new ideas about the kingdom, the new covenant that's in the Old Testament is written on tablets of stone. In the New Testament, it's written on our hearts. And so let's talk about this. And we've got some questions for you. Hope you have a great discussion. And hopefully this tutorial will help you a little bit. First of all, we asked the question about Christianity and the continuation of what began with Israel. A real important distinction to make is that the church is not a replacement for Israel, but this word continuation is important because God is continuing what he started. So much of our Old Testament is kind of getting us ready for a New Testament, a Messiah. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that. And we know right off the bat in our gospel, as Drew talked about, that Jesus was, he came for the world. And we get a clue into the Gentiles right there at the beginning of Matthew in his genealogy. So talk about that as a group, the continuation of the Old Testament into the New. That is very important as we think about the rest of the New Testament and the story that God's writing. We have one author, and that's why the meta-narrative is so important and so critical. One central truth. The next question we ask is, how is Matthew helping you grow in your understanding of Jesus as the Messiah and as your Messiah? One of the things we've been really focusing on and will continue to in this series is that we all need a bigger gospel. We all need more of Jesus in our life. Jesus is the anointed one. That's what Messiah means, God's anointed. And as we look at his role here in this new kingdom that he's establishing on earth as it is in heaven, there's values behind it, there's beliefs, there's understandings, but we need Jesus to accomplish that. I need him in my life to accomplish that. And we don't just experience Jesus at church. We need Jesus in our neighborhood. We need to take him with us on Sunday afternoon and all week. And more of Jesus in our life is going to be better for all of us. So how can we get a bigger gospel? How can we get Jesus more in our life than we already have? That's a great personal question for each person to make a statement about. How do you need more Jesus in your life? The next question we ask is we ask you to read, obviously, Matthew 5, which is the very first part of the Sermon on the Mount. And we ask the question, where are the tensions in the kingdom values that you see here in Matthew 5? So, for example, there's a tension between religion and Christianity or the gospel. And we talked about that there's a real distinction between the religious of that day and what Jesus is bringing about. And we know that because he's comparing a lot. You go all the way to the end of the Sermon on the Mount and he talks about 2 trees, 2 paths, 2 houses. One's built on the rock, the other built on the sand. And so the thing about religion and the gospel, or religion and Christianity, is they look very similar. So what are some of the tensions there? It would be good to talk about not only the tensions there between religion and the gospel, but what are the tensions between the kingdom that Jesus is talking about, the kingdom values, and American values. What's the tension there? What's the contrast? This is not the most popular message to American culture and what Americans believe. So talk about that as a group. Very important to delve into. What are some of the American values that a lot of us believe in and assume, and how are they in tension with what Jesus is saying in the Sermon on the Mount? Well, we asked the question also, how is Christianity different than religion? If you remember, I said in my sermon that religion is driven by two things. It's driven by fear and it's driven by pride. And that's what sustains it, and that's what gives it the momentum. The gospel, or Christianity, as Jesus is talking about it, is driven by two different things. It's driven by love, which is the opposite of fear. You can't love others if you're afraid, or you're driven by fear, and humility. And Jesus teaches that, but he also models that by coming to the earth and giving up his life. And so those are the really foundations of the two. How has religion influenced you? How has fear and pride driven some of your life? What's religion look like in your past? Is it still something that you struggle with? Another ways to say the same thing. The difference between religion and the gospel, or religion and Christianity. We could say religion is outward focused and outward driven. The gospel is inward focused or inward driven. It comes from the inside out. Religion outside in. Hoping that my outward actions would change my behavior or my heart. You could also say that religion is about doing. It's outward in that sense. And Christianity, or the gospel, is about being. And so in this chapter 5, Jesus says that, if you'll notice, he says we are something before he tells us to do something. He says you are salt and light. That's being. And then later on, he talks about how to apply the law and his fulfillment of the law. So as you go through chapter 5, you're going to read, again, this compare and contrast. He's saying, you have heard it said, do not commit murder. That's the law, old law. But I say to you, another path, that if you have hatred in your heart towards another, you've committed murder in your heart. So Jesus is taking the law, he's fulfilling it, and he's taking it to a new level. Still a law not to murder, but he wants to get at what's behind the murder in our heart and where our heart is. Same thing with adultery. He says, you have heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, different path, if you look at a woman with lust in your eyes, you've committed adultery in your heart. So Jesus is going after the heart in this message for sure. Another question we ask is Jesus' kingdom values and your own obedience from the heart. What does that look like? How do you engage your heart in obedience? Well, let me give you an example that you can use, because it's a great example with children. You know, if you've had children or you're around children, maybe you're a teacher or a daycare worker or you have your own children, you know, we want our children to obey. It's kind of an important thing for us, is that, you know, we want them to obey. Well, a lot of times parents stop at just teaching their children what to do or what not to do. And so we say things like, well, you should do that because I said to do that. And I am the parent, and so what I say is right. So you need to do what's right. Okay? All that's right. All that's accurate, we could say. But it's not as effective as you can be, because you can get compliance or you can get disobedience, which is going to require discipline. But there's a way to engage the heart of your child. And I think we need to think about this in terms of our relationship with God as well. Ask the moral why question. You see, when we say to our children or to someone, why should you do this? Now we're engaging the heart. Because now we give that person a chance to ask the question, why is something right? Why is something wrong? And the why question actually gets at the heart. God has said things are right and things are wrong, but do I want to obey God? And now I have a choice to obey out of the heart. It's a great little way to think about the distinction. Certainly, we know God's laws. We know what's right and wrong. But why? See, a major difference between religion and the gospel, Lake Valley, is the religion focuses on duty. Responsibility, do what's right because it's right. End of question. The gospel gives us the choice. The choice to obey because we love God, because we've been loved by God. And it engages the heart. Hope this is helpful to you. Have a great discussion, and we love you guys. Lake Valley, see you Sunday.